Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of What the Forensics. My name is Journey, and I am joined here today by the lovely Nicole and Rebecca. This week, Rebecca will be telling us all about the case of the Attica Uprising, which I'm very excited to hear about. I find prison riots very fascinating, so I'm excited to learn what all went into it and what all came out of it because it sounds like there's been a lot of reforms, which is really cool. That being said, there's no real listeners' discretion, but there are we're talking about a riot, so there will be some not so fun conversations. And before we get started, if you guys could just leave us some reviews and or comments wherever you listen, we love to read them. Make sure your apps are auto downloading. We can see that you guys have been doing that, which is so cool. So thank you so much for that. And if you could subscribe, and follow us wherever you can, we would greatly appreciate that. And with that being said, Rebecca, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Attica Uprising?
Yeah, I would be happy to. So Attica, New York is a small town. It's just about 50 minutes or so outside of Buffalo, to kind of like the southeast-ish of Buffalo. So it's kind of close to the Canadian border for a bit of reference. It was and is still presently considered an industry town because there's two correctional facilities in this tiny town which employ a large population of the residents there. So the two facilities in the town of Attica, New York, are the Attica Correctional Facility, or otherwise known as the Attica Prison, which was opened in 1931 as a maximum security prison, and then there's also the Wyoming Correctional Facility, which was opened in 1984 as a medium security prison. For today's discussion, as it's the Attica Uprising, we're going to be focusing only on the Attica prison or Attica Correctional Facility because that's where everything occurred, and the other prison wasn't even open for another decade after these events. Also, I'm just going to mention, or I'm just going to refer to the prison as Attica or as the prison, just because to say Attica Correctional Facility every time is a little bit of a mouthful.
Before you get started, why is
Yeah.
the Wyoming Correctional Facility in New York? Do you know?
Yeah. So I was really weirded out by that, but I learned that the town of Attica is in the county of Wyoming in New York.
Okay, that makes
Yeah.
sense. I was like, those
Yeah.
states could not be farther apart.
Yeah, no, I had to do a touch of digging about that. I was like, that's really weird.
Okay, that makes a little more sense.
Okay, but yeah, Attica, as I had just mentioned, it was a maximum security prison opened in 1931, and this prison was for male inmates only, so there were no women inmates housed there. It was constructed during the Great Depression, and for the time period, it was considered a state of the art facility, like one of the best basically in the US because of how many upgrades, I guess, it had compared to previously built prisons. It was also considered one of the most heavily fortified prisons in the country because of its 30-foot high walls with big concrete cell blocks reinforced by steel beams. There was 360-degree site watchtowers, gun posts, guard stations. Um, so they were very much under supervision 24/7, which it's a maximum security prison. It makes sense, but for the time, this was like a really big deal in the whole prison industry. So, given Attica is a maximum security prison, there was a high number of inmates housed there that were convicted of violent crimes or are repeat violent offenders. And additionally, historically, and I believe still today, the facility is also used to house inmates that have been transferred out of other correctional facilities because of safety concerns with other inmates or because of their behavioral problems.
Wow.
So, yeah, so there is a population at Attica that is they did commit crimes like the rest of them, but they might be a little bit more hazardous to have around given they were already kicked out of previous facilities. With that being said, I do want to remind that even though it's a max security prison, there's a lot a higher percentage of them have committed violent offenses. There were still individuals incarcerated there that were imprisoned for nonviolent crimes. And with that being said, let's get into the 70s. So in the 30s, the prison was state of the art, but by the 60s to 70s, the facility was outdated and very significantly overcrowded. The prison was designed to house about 1,200 inmates. However, by 1971, the inmate population was at 2,243. So it was almost double what the prison was designed to hold.
Wow.
In comparison to the population of inmates, there was only around 450 staff members, with 383 of them being guards. So that's I didn't do like the percentage, but that's like 75% of all the staff being guards, and the rest is spread out between administrative, medical, janitorial, rehabilitation. The other 15% is reserved for all of those roles.
Mhm.
Um, with regards to the demographics of the prison in 1971, 63% of the inmate population was reported to be either Black or Latino, and the rest of them were white. And in comparison, despite there being 383 prison guards, sorry, only one of them was a person of color. So there was 382 white guards and one Latino guard in 1971.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah,
They needed the
so
diversity hire. They needed the
they
one
needed it.
diversity hire, of course. Just the one, though. Nothing
Yeah, that's all
more.
they could handle.
Jeez.
So a bit of background on the staff of the prison. Because Attica, the town, is an industry town with the prison employing a lot of the residents, a lot of the staff at the prison were the residents of Attica. And it was also quite common that they weren't the first generation of their family to work in the prison. So it wasn't uncommon for like a father and a son to both be prison guards here, because again, it was a very small town, and this provided a lot of stable income for a lot of families. And I'm sure even today there's probably still people living there, working there, that have grandparents now that worked there. But yeah, it kind of created a bit of like a there's already obviously like a split between like inmates and guards, but it was heightened by the fact, like by the racial disparity between the guards and the inmates, and also by the fact that like so many of the guards, like they all knew each other because they grew up in the same town, so they kind of, it was abused in a way that they kind of saw it more as like a fun thing to do, like to harm the prisoners, if that makes sense. I don't know what words I'm trying to use, but I think that's what I'm trying to say. So, the late 1960s into the early 1970s was a time that there were numerous large, I'm going to say societal movements. I'm not positive if that's exactly how I want to phrase that, but there was a lot of cultural movements at the time that were impacting a large shift in like the zeitgeist of America.
There's like a lot
Um,
of civil rights activism and whatnot, correct?
yeah, the civil rights movement was actually one of the most prominent that led to this riot. So, yeah, the primary two that kind of influenced this riot were both the civil rights movement and the counterculture movement. The counterculture movement itself was, I pulled this is just like a summary from online, but it was basically a movement that was led by youth or like young adults. And I'm going to say it was kind of like the hippie era, because this was the time that they were rejecting social norms, they were rejecting racism. That's very
Yeah.
fair. That's good.
Yeah.
uh, but they were also rejecting the current state of the government, the current state of the prison system. They wanted political injustices corrected. Yeah. So, as you can probably tell, this was probably rampant in the prison as it was focused on social injustices, which many, many, many inmates at Attica were experiencing through their time there. So, in addition to the movements impacting the riot, the prisoners at Attica were severely deprived of basic rights. This very much is not a comprehensive list, but as just a couple examples of the ways that they were deprived, would be that they had very, very limited access to legal resources and representation. There was oftentimes they were denied access to their lawyers. The guards frequently abused their power and would often punish prisoners without going through the due process that they have to go through. Their mail was heavily censored. Sometime, pretty much always, their mail was opened, which is somewhat reasonable given it's a maximum security prison. But it was also very frequent that the officers would open and read the mail and then just not pass the mail on to the inmates. And they also censored a lot of books, and especially for the time, they were banning books that were deemed radical, which, if you can imagine, were about like women's rights and about civil rights and just, about being a better society. They were deemed radical. In addition, non Christian religious practices were very often denied. In particular, this was like there was a lot of Muslim inmates there, and they were very frequently denied the opportunity to pray or given location to pray. Only Christian religious practices were basically allowed to happen. Their meals were often spoiled or just didn't have enough nutritional value to really be anything of substance. Inmates were issued one roll of toilet paper per month per inmate, and they were only allowed to shower once per week because of the overcrowding. There simply wasn't enough space and availability for all of the inmates to take regular showers. There was forced labor in which they were forced, basically, it's a prison, so they used them as slave labor. Essentially, they were paid at most like probably 8 to 16 cents a day to do this hard physical labor. And then there was also, as you can imagine, very rampant racism by the guards towards many of the inmates. So all of these factors compounded as prisoners nationwide were experiencing similar issues in their own prisons and were beginning to also seek reforms and justice. So, at Attica specifically, all of the unrest kind of came to a head in 1971 when a man named George Jackson was killed by police at a different prison all the way in California, at the San Quentin State Prison.
Hmm.
So, little bit of background about that, and I'm going to preface it by saying George Jackson's another person that could have like a whole discussion on. So, I'm just going to float through this a little. But George Jackson was a black man arrested in 1960 at the age of 18 years old for stealing $70 worth of gas from a gas station. There was actually a lot of evidence to support his innocence, that he didn't do it. However, being the time period and the prosecution, I guess, just had something out to get him. I think it was because he had a couple other petty charges. So other like minor theft charges. But either way, even though there was evidence to support that he didn't actually steal from this gas station, he ended up receiving an indeterminate sentence of 1 year to life.
That's
Whoa.
wild.
Yeah, for stealing $70 of gas.
And the range too to have 1 year to life. Just
And it's
pick a time.
indeterminate, so they're not
Yeah.
even telling him.
Yeah.
How
Wild.
can you
Yeah.
even sentence someone that? Like, it doesn't, like, from an administrative standpoint, even, like, that doesn't.
Well, yeah, like I feel like that doesn't align with like the existing case law.
Exactly. And it's so easy to then lose track of him, like,
Mhm.
in the system, too. You're just like, well, 1 year to life, so, like, maybe when we think of him again, we'll let him out. And you just never think of him again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And that would kind of be apparent in the fact that I'm not okay, he would have been in prison for about 11 years because he was arrested in 1960, and then he was killed in 1971 in prison.
Wow.
Um so during the first 10 years of his prison sentence, he was kept in solitary confinement for 7.5.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, so he had 23
Wow.
hours a day to himself for 7.5 years for possibly stealing
Maybe.
a
Yeah.
can of gas.
That's, like, there's no need to be in solitary confinement for 7.5 years.
No,
In
absolutely not.
general, let alone for $70 worth of gas.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, so for a lot of people, obviously, like this would break them. It would break me. I
Yeah.
know that. But he tried not to let it treat him that way. During his time in solitary confinement, he got very active in activism and in like the civil rights movement. Just from his cell, he was known to like do a lot of writing, and he read a lot. And basically, he became a pretty influential inmate amongst the others. I don't know at what point it was during his sentence, but he did end up joining the Black Panthers as a member, and he also became a co-founder of a Black Power, of a prison gang that was very active during the Black Power movement. So he was a co-founder of the Black Guerrilla family. Guerrilla, like the fighting style, like GUE. Yeah.
Right.
Um,
I think we should do an episode on the Black Panthers because I don't know much about them and I would love to learn more.
I agree because I don't go into any detail about the Black Panthers in this episode, but there were a couple Black Panthers involved in the Attica riot. Like they were some of the spokespeople for the inmates.
Why?
Um, but yeah, so that's just a little bit about George Jackson. He became a huge activist, so a lot of people saw him as like spoke of him very highly, thought of him very highly. Yeah, and obviously they thought what happened to him given the apparent crime was just completely unjust, which it was. It's completely unjust. But anyway, on August 21st of 1971, George was allegedly involved in an escape attempt from San Quentin prison with a couple other inmates. And this is a whole again other story that we could do an episode on, but basically it led to George being shot and killed by prison guards and also led to the death of 3 other guards and 2 inmates.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, so that specifically, despite being across the country, inmates who were present during the Attica riot have stated in later interviews that the killing of George Jackson was a major influence in the timing of the riots that occurred there. So just over 2 weeks after George's death, at about 8:30 in the morning on September 9th, 1971, at Attica Prison, as inmates were being escorted from the A block, which is one of 4 housing blocks of the prison, to they were being escorted through Tunnel 5, which is a narrow hallway that was known as like a congestion point, and it was I don't completely remember where that hallway led, but I know they were being led from A block down the hall by guards to another area. At some point during this move, an altercation occurred, which led to 2 inmates being removed from the line by guards. I think this kind of started as like a conflict the night before, and then the guards were kind of just holding a grudge over it and then took advantage of it to remove them from the line that morning. And the inmates kind of took this as a threat from the guards or saw it as like intimidation, and they weren't having it, obviously. So this resulted in the inmates confronting the guards in Tunnel 5, this congestion point, and it didn't end terribly well for the guards as there was only about 4 or 5 guards present for 30 to 40 inmates.
Wow.
Wow.
You'd think
That's
they'd have more coverage for that many inmates.
I was going to say, considering the coverage you need, the ratio at schools with teachers to
Mhm.
students, you would expect maybe something similar for dangerous offenders.
Yeah,
Yeah.
kids that didn't commit violent offenses are looked over more heavily than this.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. So by 9 a.m., only about half an hour after, inmates had overpowered the guards. One guard did end up dying during this altercation, but it was noted during a documentary that they didn't I don't know if it was intentional to kill this guard, but it was clear that not every inmate's intention was violence as the inmates were moving out of tunnel 5 getting to like the next area to try to gather the keys from the guards. A group of 3 or 4 inmates took the body of the died guard and brought it basically to seek medical attention, and they basically told the other guards, are like, hey, this your friend, he really needs help. We're not trying to like take him. Yeah, so there was good people. Like they're not just strictly doing this to be violent. But yeah, they moved from Tunnel 5 into D Block, where they managed to get the keys and take control of the control center of the entire prison, or at least that
Oh.
part of the prison.
Mhm.
Um, and during their takeover, they managed to also take 42 of the prison staff members as hostages to be used during negotiations. So for a little bit of just like reference, the prison was split into four different large blocks. It kind of looked like a four, like the game at Recess Foursquare. You all stand in your different square. From
Mhm.
an aerial view, that's kind of how the prison looks, and then there's tunnels going, separating them into four quadrants with like the control center in the very middle. That control center was nicknamed Times Square because of how busy it was. It was like the main hub of the prison.
Mhm.
Um, so, as I had said, during an attempt to seize control, one guard was killed, but they ended up bringing him to try to get medical attention. And so, yeah, successfully, they managed to get into D-Yard. The guards were able to take back control of most of the prison, but the inmates had completely taken over D-Yard. This was officially basically like a barricade. This is where they were staying, and it's where they would have to attempt to negotiate from. So, by the end of this morning that the riot had began, there was 1,281 inmates that had joined together in D Yard to join in on the uprising. So that's about half of the
Half.
entire prison
Yeah.
population.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
The inmates themselves, aside from the initial takeover, which like led to a death, weren't acting in hostility or violence. It was actually kind of like based on the descriptions of the survivors of it, like the inmates through the documentary, it was kind of like community building. Like they all put aside differences and stuff. Like it was known that it was like 2/3 of the population were black or Latino, 1/3 was white, but it was said that they acted as if there was no racial disparity between the inmates at that point. They were all just working together for a common cause. So yeah, the inmates worked together to create a plan on demanding prison reforms for a betterment to their current conditions. So this was basically a list that they were trying to compile to have negotiating points to like to work with, so that they're not just going into like a discussion empty-handed. So by the afternoon of September 9th, they had began to organize a leadership committee to communicate the inmates' demands. The demands were compiled into what is known as the Attica Liberation Faction Manifesto of Demands, which was a compilation of complaints written together by them. The list, I kept finding different numbers between like 26 and 33 demands, but I think it was around 33. And some of these included better food and access to healthcare, freedom to practice religion, an end to the physical abuse perpetrated by guards, better visitation rights, and they also, one of the big drawbacks for the negotiating on the other side was that they were demanding they fire basically the current head of the Attica prison for basically knowing all of this was happening and not doing anything.
Yeah, very reasonable demands.
Yeah, I was gonna say those seem like basic human rights that they should be granted
Yeah,
regardless.
I
Exactly.
would agree. They also demanded regular showers and toothbrushes. I think that's fair too.
Yep.
Yep. 100%.
Yeah, so this leadership committee that was being organized, because obviously it would be hard to negotiate with 1,200 separate prisoners. So they were basically, it was basically like an elected group of five individuals the inmates thought would have the best chance of representing them. And these five people were Donald Noble, Peter Butler, Frank Lott, Carl Jones L, and Herbert Blyden X. So once they presented their list of demands, because police and politicians were very much waiting on the other side of the wall to hear what was happening, the negotiations began basically immediately.
I also
So,
want to point out though the fact that they have to negotiate that. Like, why is that a negotiation point to be
right?
granted those things?
Yeah, I know. I completely agree. Like, it should be so easy. It should be like, hey, We want toilet paper and showers, and you can have your hostages. Why wasn't that the end of the story?
Like,
Yeah.
we'll give you 2 toilet paper rolls, maybe half the shower though. Like,
Yeah.
no, just give it all in full.
Yeah. So now outside the prison, and this is still day one, this is still September 9th, there were observers kind of congregating now, like outside of the D block to figure out what was going on. And this included journalists from like various big newspapers, I think including the New York Times. There was various US politicians and congressmen, like including the governor of New York. And there was also political activists present, such as some members of the Black Panthers. And yeah, they went to the prison basically just to see what was going down. And in terms of like the newspapers and activists, they were there to make sure the police didn't do anything
Yeah.
drastic.
Yeah.
I didn't write anything specific about this, but I will say that there was a group of observers put together to form like what they called the Committee of Observers. And some of these people, I believe, were actually allowed to enter the prison at one point and like basically to make sure the hostages were okay, kind of see the conditions they were living under, and kind of like help with negotiating powers. I believe one of these men were one of the head journalists or one of like a big journalist for the New York Times. Anyways, that was day one, basically. So the riot started, observers are joining. They've made a manifesto of demands. There wasn't a lot of activity on day two, which was September 10th, as they just continued negotiating with the inmates, between the inmates and the people outside of the prison, like the politicians. However, the negotiations were like arguably going well. Of the 33 requests made, officials said that they would accept 28 of the requests, but they were outright refusing to even humor the demand for amnesty from prosecution for the uprising. Because that was one of their things. They said, once this is all said and done with, I don't want to be charged with anything related to this riot.
Mhm.
Because it's
Right.
it's for the betterment of our justice system, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, authorities weren't happy with that. They're like, there's no way that you're getting amnesty from this, but you can have 28 other things.
I mean, like, that kind of makes sense from the authorities' perspective of like, if we give them amnesty for this prison uprising, every single other prison in the entire
Mm.
like United States is then also going to uprise, and then we're
Yeah.
going to have to all give them amnesty, and it just kind of is like,
But then you also have to question though, why are they uprising? Like, if
oh
they
yeah,
are aware that the living conditions in all of these prisons are at a point that would cause an uprising, shouldn't that be something then granted amnesty so other prisons improve upon in the future, right?
Yeah, so that the
yeah,
risings don't happen. I can
I get
see it
I get the
from both
authorities are
sides.
not
yeah,
like that at the time though, so I totally get where you're coming from, but I was like,
Yeah.
being an ethical human being and just like understanding that people have rights, you would
yeah.
be like, okay, well, looks like we have to reform these things.
Yeah.
But that seems too easy, apparently.
Way too easy to just reform everything. We need to make it a little tricky.
Yeah.
So I just want to note, like through all of this, I mentioned that there was 42 hostages taken. The hostages were treated like, given the situation and being kidnapped, the hostages were treated very well. The inmates were not allowed to harm the hostages, and the role of taking care of them and kind of giving them medical treatment was given to a select group of Black Muslims at the prison, because it was said that their religious practices meant that they preached like nonviolence and they wanted to just take care of their community. So that's kind of why they specifically were tasked with taking care of the hostages. But yeah, one of the reasons they took care of them, one, was because a lot of them, some of them were bad people, but they also recognized that these hostages are innocent people caught up in something bigger. And also, they probably had more negotiation power if the cops knew that the hostages were all alive and well.
Yeah.
So, while this was like no walk in the park for inmates, at least in the beginning, they were having a pretty decent time. Like, they were setting up bedding and like shelters and stuff in the main yard so they could all stay together. Because one unfortunate thing about this was they had barricaded the D yard, but the DR didn't have any sense of shelter, so they were just under the scorching sun for as long as the sun was out all day. So
Hmm.
they used like bedding and stuff like that to kind of make canopies over them to keep themselves out of the heat. They even set up a sanitation and medical station in case inmates needed it, and a barbershop in the yard in case they needed to go have their little barbershop chats and get their hair cut. It was also said that like if a brawl did occur in the D yard between inmates, because it does still happen, you are still in a very large overcrowded prison with probably multiple different gangs. It was said that other inmates would make an effort to actually make like a circle around the hostages to ensure they wouldn't be like a secondary victim in like the inmate scuffle.
That's nice.
Uh-huh. I agree. They at least they were taking care of them.
They modeled how they wanted to be treated.
Treated. Yeah.
Exactly. They were like, these are our prisoners, but we're gonna treat them like humans.
Yeah, like, see, it's not that hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So on day 3, they had continued with their negotiations, but this came to a complete standstill after officials were outright refusing once again to grant the full amnesty. And also now they were refusing the demand that the prisoner superintendent be removed from his position. They also said, nope, that's not happening. You can have all of your rights and your rights, but this guy's got to keep his job. And so, justifiably, the stall in negotiation made inmates feel quite tense because they weren't really sure what the police or what the authorities were now planning because there was a stall, they weren't hearing much. And honestly, inmates were right to be nervous about possible escalation, as throughout September 11th, which was day 3, unbeknownst to the inmates, there were both state police and the National Guard preparing just outside of the prison walls for an attack, basically. On day 4, tensions were high between both the authorities and the inmates. Authorities were still not budging at all on their negotiations, and now the governor of New York, despite, I wouldn't say the committee of observers begged him, because I I just feel like I shouldn't portray them in that way, but inmates really wanted to speak to the governor of New York in person to express their concerns, to say like, because he's like the big boss in New York, like surely he can get something done. But authorities said for the governor's safety, he was not allowed to enter the prison. Um, the committee of observers was very much trying to tell him to go in, but in the end, the governor did completely refuse to even go in and talk to the inmates. So, yeah, that also just led to further escalations. The team of observers also urged officials to make one more final appeal to the inmates to accept the deal, one more chance at negotiations. But it was noted that the governor had specifically instructed them that he didn't want them to state it like an ultimatum because they didn't want the inmates to have any clue that they were actively preparing to attack them if they denied their plea deal or their negotiation deal. So, with the rising tensions and a hunch that something was happening, inmates also began making defenses inside the yard and kind of like to try to block the wall or the entrances. This wouldn't end up being terribly helpful, however, as on Monday, September 13th at 1971, in 1971, sorry. So this was 4 days after the beginning. At 9:46 in the morning, a helicopter flew over the prison and began dropping tear gas over the entire prison yard.
Oh my goodness.
Well,
After this happened, about 550 law enforcement officers rushed the yard, and for an entire 6 minutes, they brutally assaulted the inmates, just complete open gunfire of shotguns and rifles for a full 6 minutes.
holy shit.
Wow.
And for what though? Like, oh my gosh, that's what gets me. The intensity of the aggression coming from law enforcement.
Yeah, and the inmates weren't even threatening violence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no need to barge in there and just shoot everyone
Especially
at all.
550 law enforcement officers. That is excessive.
It is excessive. Yeah, there's more
And the
police officers
helicopter?
storming that than there were guards.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
helicopter dropping tear gas, like, why? Come on.
right. Yeah,
Yeah, and
it
it's not like
was
anything they're asking for is really that unreasonable.
Mhm.
no, no, exactly. It was a brutal ambush.
Mhm.
At the end of the 6 minutes, 33 inmates and 10 of the hostages had been killed, and there was dozens more suffering from severe and critical injuries. But the survivors, like the surviving inmates, also didn't get off easy, as it was reported that officials or authorities that conducted this ambush then basically held the inmates captive for a couple of days and berated them and abused them in many ways, including stripping naked and just crawling through the yard, basically like a dog.
Jeez.
They denied those that were injured any medical attention. They beat them. And there was also reports of torture against inmates, although I didn't read specifics about the torture.
Yeah.
I
Um,
wouldn't put it past them though.
Yeah.
Like
no.
with
It's
everything we've
also
heard.
yeah. It's crazy that even like in that huge ambush, there was no regard for the hostages. So it was
Yeah.
just like, we don't even care if you kill the hostages or not, because we're just gonna do it anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
And
what? That's
that's
yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting point because initially the authorities were trying to claim that one of the reasons their ambush was justified was because the hostages were being killed by inmates and not authorities. So the authorities claimed that the ten hostages that had died had their throats sliced by the prison inmates.
Oh.
However, the autopsies on them actually found that all but one of the dead hostages were killed by police gunfire.
Wow.
Wow.
Wow. Oh my
That's
gosh.
crazy.
This riot led to a national outcry for reform once the news got out. Very understandably, glad America was on that page.
Yeah.
Um, After it was revealed that law enforcement was in fact responsible for the deaths of almost all the hostages. So,
Yeah.
initially, before the autopsies were publicized, the authorities were selling to the media that the inmates were animals, basically, that they were the ones that killed the hostages, blame them, blah, blah, blah. But then, as soon as the autopsies came out, it was like a full 180 on the authorities, and they were like, we demand justice.
Yeah.
Um, there was also countless civil rights groups, journalists, lawyers, all wanting to cover or become involved with the inmates' fight for justice. And an independent commission was created to investigate the widespread abuse and the subsequent cover up that was occurring of the abuse in the prison. So, as a result of the riot, because as you know, they were not granted amnesty, that was something that was denied them. 62 inmates ended up being indicted on crimes supposedly related to the riot, and these would include charges of murder, attempted murder, assault, kidnapping, and riot and conspiracy.
Hmm.
Yeah, and despite the fact that it was confirmed that law enforcement killed 10 hostages or 9 hostages, there was not a single law enforcement officer indicted for the killing of any of the killed inmates or hostages. They were just never held responsible.
That's
Wow.
really annoying.
hmm So, the riot at Attica Prison was an instrumental event in the reform of American prisons because not only did it expose the inhumane conditions that many US prison inmates were facing, not only in Attica, but nationwide, but it also sparked the prisoner rights movement, which sought to organize better basic rights for inmates across America. So these riots also influenced two landmark legal cases that are used as case law today. These would be Wolf v. McDonald in 1974, which helps ensure that inmates get due process in their disciplinary hearings, and also Estelle v. Gamble in 1976, which ruled that there was deliberate indifference to serious medical needs is unconstitutional. So if someone needs medical attention and you don't provide it, that's unconstitutional, basically.
Yeah.
Um, Also in 1976, like the same year as that case, the at the time new governor of New York, so it wasn't the same governor that was refusing to visit the inmates. New governor of New York, Hugh Carey, announced that he would be, quote, closing the book on Attica just 5 years after the riot. So, for the 62 inmates that were indicted on crimes related to the riot, he officially pardoned all of those that had pled guilty to receive lighter sentences, and then he also commuted the sentences of those people that were already convicted.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it was a good decision, a good step in the right direction. However,
Yeah.
an unfortunate part of closing the book was that during like the investigations that happened in like the subsequent 5 years after the riot, there was pending cases against some law I think 20 officers or law enforcement officials for their involvement in like the killings. But because we needed to close the whole book, he also just dropped all of those cases against the law enforcement.
Oh, that sucks.
Hmm.
Yeah. So Carey emphasized that just because there'd be no criminal action taken on the cases, civil suits were still allowed to proceed, which resulted in surviving inmates and inmates' families. They ended up suing the state of New York for civil rights violations, justifiably. And it was a very long and hard fought court battle. But in the year 2000, the court battle was finally settled and inmates were awarded $8 million. I think total, like for the whole team.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
but yeah.
That's like a 30-year court battle, no? Did I get my
Yeah.
years wrong? That's crazy.
I'm not personally positive when the civil suit began, but I know it was like the 70s, I believe.
Yeah. Which still like 8 million doesn't even feel like enough to then pay for the lawyers who worked
No.
for decades on this
Yeah,
case.
well, yeah. So I guess I should be more specific. I did read that they were technically awarded $12 million to settle, but 4 million of that did go towards lawyer fees.
Okay. That makes more sense, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but overall, the Attica Uprising was an instrumental event in the reform of US prison systems, and it did end up leading to many positive changes that bettered inmates' conditions. Its impacts were and still are far reaching. As we said, like it sparked the prison rights movement, which ended up sparking massive reform all throughout the prison systems in the States. However, in the 1980s into 1990s, many of these positive reforms initially seen from the uprising had been reversed because of the new, ever so lovely, tough on crime era that began with Nixon. And this saw a huge influx of inmates being imprisoned, which led to even more overcrowding in the US prison system. And the tough on crime era also led to defunding, or at least significantly pulling back on the funding for reform programs, because policies were reverting back to a focus on punishing offenders instead of trying to rehabilitate them.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah, so that's all I have on the uprising. There, like, I listened to a bit of a podcast about this, and it honestly, you could truly do like a mini series on all of the specifics of this, because there was still like, even of 2005, there was still like civil suits being settled. And I think,
Wow.
Wow.
again, like I didn't go into like present day stuff, but I think there might have been more reparations as recent as like 2017.
Oh my
Wow.
goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's crazy. It's just wild the like far-reaching effects that it had,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
that it's still being dealt with today and it happened almost 40 years ago.
50
I
years
Almost
recommend.
ago.
50 years ago.
Yeah.
Over
Yeah.
50 years ago. Wow.
I recommend to our listeners too. There's a book called "Are Prisons Obsolete" by Angela Davis, and it goes into like it discusses the Attica Uprising and everything, but basically goes into why prisons aren't needed and why they're more harmful than not. And
Yeah.
she does a very, very, very good job discussing it. It's a quick read. It's a very short read, but beautifully written. I highly recommend.
So with that,
Cool.
does
Well,
she ever address like what we should do with the people who are being sent to prisons instead of prisons?
It's a lot of like societal and cultural reform and transformation on how to deal with those people, I guess. Because she goes into a lot of how like the convict lease system, and then how in America a lot of prisons are privately funded.
mm-hmm.
So
They're for
getting
profit, which
they're
is
for
fucked.
profit. So the more prisoners you have, the more money that jail's making. So the first step would be getting rid of that. system, that kind of thing. So just dismantling the systems. And I can't remember if she provides exact suggestions as to what to do afterwards, but I don't know if there really is one thing to do. It's
Yeah.
hard to think of without the implementation.
Yeah.
I don't know. I
Yeah,
just
that makes
recommend.
sense. Yeah, for sure. Well, crazy. Thank you, Rebecca. That's a wild, wild case. Yeah, prisons as a system are very, very intriguing. And I know like my family went through a phase of watching like Prison Break and a bunch of prison documentaries and stuff growing up. And it's just a completely different like ecosystem, really.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's sad that they had to resort to this riot in order to feel heard and get these like basic human rights.
Yes.
This toilet paper, like, yeah,
One
crazy.
roll a month.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not. And then
That's
one shower a
inhumane.
week. Yeah,
Yeah. I
like
can't imagine like the state of the hygiene of that prison between the overcrowding, the lack of hygiene products, and the lack of access to showers.
exactly. Everything's dirty. They're gonna get so sick. They obviously don't have the medical staff
Mm-hmm.
that they need for that, or the janitorial
Mhm.
staff to make sure that it's clean. Like it's just, yeah, awful. But yeah, so I see, Nicole, you have a forensic corner that you wanted to share with us.
I do. I think Rebecca's gonna really like this one. It has to do with the Titanic.
Oh, I might
Ooh.
even already know what it is then.
It was a TikTok I sent you. I don't know if you've seen that, but 3D scans have come out about the Titanic.
That's
So
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 cool.
cool.
there was deep sea mapping that was done on the Titanic, where over 700,000 images were taken of the debris or what remains of the Titanic on the ocean floor. And they were able to create an exact 3D reconstruction, and they created like a digital twin of this Titanic.
That's so
And so,
cool.
right, you get the entirety of the wreckage. You get to see it in two parts. You can see where the bow and the stern separate by about 800 meters in between them. Like there was a quote in the article I read to you, and it says, "It's like a crime scene. You need to see what the evidence is in the context of where it is, and having a comprehensive view of the entirety of the wreck site is key to understanding what happened here," unquote. And so one of the big things too that was really interesting to see, I'll actually let me send you the links because the photos are beautiful. The first scan came out in 2021. Nope, 2023, I think.
Ooh.
But they just released additional photos. And
God,
so
that's
they,
so
Crazy.
detailed.
right? Yeah, this is the most detailed we've been able to see. And so they've been studying as well. You can see the boiler rooms, and it's believed to be a point where the ship broke into two. And so reports from survivors of the Titanic said that the lights were still on as the ship was plunging into the water. And so a valve is also seen in one of the photos to have been in an open position, indicating that the steam was still flowing into the electricity generating systems. And so this was
Wow.
like engineers led by Joseph Bell who were staying behind in the belly of the boat, shoveling coal into the furnaces to keep the lights on and to try and get people the ability to escape, essentially, with the
Wow.
lifeboats and everything. And so
That's
now
amazing.
we had the eyewitness accounts of survivors and what we kind of speculated, but to be able to see that in high definition is just truly astounding.
Yeah.
Um, and so they're saying to, the Titanic was supposed to be this unsinkable ship. That obviously wasn't the case. It did sink, but it was designed to stay afloat even if four of its watertight compartments flooded in the bottom. However, from the looks of it, it calculates that the iceberg kind of grazed and damaged six compartments, which is what caused or was a contributing factor as to why it sank. And
Wow.
they believe that it came down to the size of a piece of paper, an A4 piece of paper that was the difference between sinking and not sinking, was a hole that big.
Oh my
Oh my
gosh.
god, that's so crazy. Like that
Right?
it's so small compared to like the size of that ship.
Right? Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
fact that If they had like 2 less compartments filled.
It would still be
Sorry, that was my Google telling me my dishwasher's finished running.
okay.
Oh, nice.
Nice. But yeah, personal possessions were seen on the scattered across the seafloor, just kind of bringing light to the human tragedy aspect of it too. Scans showed close-ups detailing a porthole that was likely hit by the iceberg, which does align with eyewitness reports of these survivors that ice was coming into people's cabins during the collision.
Wow.
Yeah, and obviously the scans are very new, but it is providing new clues about what happened on that night. And it is said that it's going to take experts years to fully scrutinize every detail of the 3D replica. But it is, I think personally, it's a very important piece to have because the Titanic's only going to disintegrate from today onwards. So to
Mhm.
have that captured now, even if maybe it's not 100% accurate, can still give scientists kind of the chance to look into what actually happened.
I know
Yeah,
they used like underwater drones basically to take those. It would be so incredible if they could get those to get inside and take the same sort of scan on the inside.
Right?
yeah, that would be
I'm sure
really,
they'll
really
probably
cool.
attempt it at some point because wasn't James Cameron able to go in with his submarine and see the?
I don't know if he was about to go in, but he had
Okay.
many, many trips down in a
Mm-hmm.
submersible just to kind of see. So that's been done
Yeah.
before. Like a lot of submersibles have gone down to like capture footage or video, but never
Yeah.
really the entirety of the Titanic in one go in that level of detail.
Mm-hmm.
So
Crazy.
crazy what
That's so
technology can
cool.
do.
So cool.
Yeah, I love that. That's so neat. I can't wait to like see what else comes out from that because it's just a big mystery and it's just cool to have answers.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
also neat like I never thought of the people who stayed and like shoveled coal to keep the lights on. Like what a huge sacrifice on their parts. Like
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. But thank you for sharing.
No worries.
That's so cool. I love the Titanic.
Me too. I
It's
was
so
also obsessed
interesting.
with that as a kid. I said last episode that Pompeii was my Roman Empire, but so was the Titanic.
Yeah. Same. Very much same. Okay. Our next episode is going to be on Rena Verk. I don't know anything about her. I think she was a case that had been recommended to us. So I'm excited to learn more about what happened with her case. And if you want to hear a little bit more about us and stay up to date with what we're doing, you can find us on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok at What the Forensics. Our website is whattheforensics.ca, and it's kind of your one stop shop for everything forensics. Our email is whattheforensics@gmail.com, and you can reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns. We also have a little like form on our website where you can send us any inquiries about anything. And I guess with that being said, this has been another episode of What the Forensics. We hope you learned something new, and we will see you next time. Bye!
Bye.
Just a reminder to everyone that we are not professionals in the forensic science field. We are just interested in forensics and want to share what we are learning with our listeners. We're trying to give you the most accurate information, but we are human and can make mistakes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you next week.